Hi everyone, for those that weren't here in the previous talk, my name is Marina Scarpelli and I'm gonna talk about one of the studies I did for my master's degree back in Brazil. I was looking into the relationships between soundscapes and landscapes again, but now in the Atlantic forest, and my supervisors were Dr. Milton Ribeiro and Dr. Camila Teixeira. This study was published at the beginning of the year in Ecological Indicators, so if you're interested in any of the details that I unfortunately won't have the time to talk about, you can check the publication. So the Atlantic forest is considered a hotspot for biodiversity. It contains 7 out of the 9 biggest watersheds in Brazil. And in the map here on the left, you can see in colors the original cover for the biome with its different regions, and the remnants are the areas in black. The Atlantic forest is the most threatened biome in Brazil. In 2009, there was only 12% of natural vegetation cover in the area. It is the home for 72% of the Brazilian population, meaning that we have 145 million people in this region, and also has 3 of the biggest urban centers in South America. So in this map here, on the left, we have three different points in time of land covers for the Atlantic forest, so 1962, 1981, and 2000, and it's clear how the natural vegetation was cleared, especially for the establishment of urban areas and for agriculture. Acoustics, as we know, has several advantages such as allowing large spatial coverage, unattended monitoring, and being able to provide relatively rapid assessments that can be repeated over time. That seems to fit perfectly to measure the degree of impact the Atlantic forest is suffering. So thinking about that, I wanted to measure how sounds through acoustic indices vary between habitats. Those were forest areas, stream within forest, and crop fields, but also how indices vary in different natural vegetation cover and in different scales. So we sampled 22 landscapes in the São Paulo state in Brazil. As you can see from the map here, it is a highly fragmented area, as I mentioned before. We sampled each one of these 22 landscapes for 3 months using SM3s at a sampling rate of 48 kilohertz. Within each one of the 22 landscapes, we had 3 sampling points, one in a pasture or crop field area, one in a forest patch, and one in a forest in a stream within a forest patch. So each one of these habitats were sampled for 1 month. That's why we had 3 months per landscape in the previous slide. For each sampling point, we draw then 5 different buffers. They go from 100-meter buffers to 2-kilometer buffers, and we quantified the land cover in each one of these buffers. We had different percentages of land covers in different buffers. So as we can see here from this plot, as expected for the 100-meter buffers, we had more natural vegetation and more eucalyptus plantations in the forest points. I just want to highlight here that eucalyptus plantations in Brazil, they are a big issue because we cut the natural forest to plant eucalyptus, which is an invasive plant species back there. It's not like here in Australia where we have the beautiful woodlands with several species of eucalyptus. It's monoculture over there. For the open areas, then we had a larger percentage of crop yields, and in the stream areas we had a higher percentage of water in the land cover classes. For the 2 kilometers buffer, so the biggest buffer we had on the other end, we didn't have as much variation between the points, so the habitat, so they seem pretty much having pretty much the same percentage of different land covers for the 2 kilometers buffers. So using the percentage of natural vegetation cover and water, we created then these classes of habitat. So it goes from 0 to 100% natural vegetation cover. Then you will have like class 1, which is the lowest percentage of vegetation cover, and class 5, which has the highest percentage of vegetation cover. We did this to decrease a little bit on the variation, because when we were doing the analysis, we realized that we had too much information and it was really hard to find the patterns. So we did this to be able to summarize information better and to see the patterns a little bit better. So we calculated acoustic indices from the recordings, and we measured then the differences in medians between different habitats. So the differences in the medians of acoustic indices in the pasture and the forest and the stream ones, and also the differences in acoustic indices medians in the vegetation classes within different buffers. So, as expected, the background noise had high levels in the points within stream areas, and we think this is because of the stream noise, which is like the water noise, and it is the main cause of interference in acoustic communication in terrestrial environments, but also the background noise can be called as keynote sounds, and they are directly influenced by the vegetation and geography. And they have the same masking effect as the stream noise. So we believe that it's important to understand how the background noise is affecting, can be affecting acoustic communication in different environments. As for the indices expected to measure biophony, such as activity, mid-frequency cover, and entropy, we found that the higher values are in areas with low to intermediate vegetation cover. And then we had two main conclusions regarding this. First of all, the areas with less vegetation will also have less obstacles and therefore less sound attenuation, but also that animals can be using these areas with low to intermediate levels of disturbance to feed, for example. This is supported by the fact that we did not measure areas with high urban density. Our less vegetation areas are mainly pasture and crop fields, which can be used for feeding and do not represent such a rough matrix for most of the wildlife. As for acoustic complexity index, we had higher medians in stream areas and lower in the forested areas, but also we had lower medians and in intermediate vegetation classes. ACI was developed originally to quantify avian fauna, but it is also documented to have a good relationship with geophony. So that's why I believe we had high values in the stream areas. We also had the NDSI values all above 1 that indicate a high quality habitat. So even though we measured in a high fragmented area, it was quantified, the ratio between biophony and anthrophony was indicating a high quality habitat. And again, we think that this is because we did not measure in or near urban center or industrial areas. It is fragmented areas, but mainly for crop fields or eucalyptus plantation. As for the scale of effect, the values tested were from 100-meter buffer to 2-kilometer buffer, and we had significant values for different indices at different scales. Usually the indices that were significant for the habitat analysis were also significant for the small scale of effect. So this means that these indices, they are more affected to the immediate surroundings, and we have different indices affected for the 2-kilometer buffers. Our significant values were for the two ends, so we had either 100-meter buffers or 2-kilometer buffers as significant. We argue that this happened because these are the ends, so we know that different indices are affected for different scales, but we don't think that these are the definitive values that the index respond to. This is just a bias because we had these two values as the end, so we need more testing to know if the indices can be affected for even a smaller scale or even a bigger scale. We think that we need more studies especially in more homogeneous area, because we test in a highly fragmented area, and as we saw from our methods, we had to lose some information in the fragmentation because we had to group classes of vegetation cover together to understand the pattern. So we believe that studies in more homogeneous areas could help understanding the patterns without having to lose that much information. So then we can move to more, let's say, complicated analysis in highly fragmented areas. But also, we also believe that we need to test different variables such as climate and other landscape measurements like connectivity, patch size, or edge effects, especially for these highly fragmented areas. We believe that this study is a scratch on the surface of the relationships between landscape and soundscapes. There is yet a lot to be explored, especially in tropical environments with high levels of biodiversity. But we also believe that this is a good starting point, especially regarding the scale of effect analysis when thinking on experimental designs and how to sample, how do we elaborate our experimental designs. I'd like to thank my supervisors, Camila and Miltinho, the environmental modeling and analysis postgraduate program where I did my master's, and CAPES and CNPq for the funding.
Thank you, Marina, for this very clear presentation again. And let's open the floor to the discussion and to questions. Is there any question from the panelists? I can see here a question from Sandra Müller. Please, Sandra.
Yeah, good morning or good evening, Martina. Thanks for this nice talk. And I think you raised a very good point there about background noise and quantifying the amount of background noise you have in a habitat. And I think we could actually pay more attention to this. And yeah, so it's more just a comment. I think it's very important. It could be very useful to quantify the background noise, the signal to noise ratio, and then use this as a covariate in our statistics, the same way that we would use other environmental variables, let's say fertility at a site, or because it constrains the acoustic space that is available for the animals. So yeah, thanks for that. And maybe you have some more thoughts on this. So yeah, we can discuss it.
Thank you.
Yes, yes, indeed. Very important to include the signal to noise ratio always in what we measure, of course. I see Jérôme. Jérôme, please.
Yes, thank you very much. Very nice study. Just a short comment about the use of background noise. I think that Almo did already remark about that? Is it really background noise or just background soundscape or something like that? Anyway, did you try at some point to have a kind of ground truth data set so that where you could annotate the files and see how much your indices correlate with manual annotation, with what we name ground truth? Because sometimes I feel that the idea is to use a bit quickly the indices without checking before how they work and how they behave in the habitat you are monitoring.
Yeah, I agree. I didn't do that for this work, for my master's. I didn't have the time, unfortunately, but I know that there are other students from the same research group that they are now doing this, measuring and quantifying for frogs and birds, how the acoustic indices are correlated with biodiversity by tagging, manually tagging all the recordings.
Excellent, because it's very difficult to find experts for the tropical area, so it's always a big issue. Thank you.
Thank you.
There is a question from Klaus Riede. Important study. Would be interested in embed this approach into ongoing biodiversity monitoring schemes. It's actually a comment, but if you want to give a comment on this comment.
Yeah, I think, as I said before, I don't think we are done with the acoustic indices yet. I think there are still things that we can do with them. They are good tool to provide this big picture of what's going on. But I agree that we have to investigate more and find better ways to correlate directly with biodiversity, because this is still a bit tricky, I think, to do.
Yeah, sorry, I think my comment was a little bit misleading. What I meant is, and this is also concerning Gianni's talk, if it wouldn't be wise to embed these acoustic studies into ongoing long-term monitoring schemes. I don't know if you know about the ALTER, long-term ecological research network sites. These are distributed all over the world, and I think there are also some in the Atlantic rainforest. So there you have something like Sandra Müller mentioned yesterday in Panama, like 50 hectare plots or something like that. So these are high intense monitoring sites, not only for acoustics, but also for species diversity, tree diversity, meteorological data, etc. So if you combine the acoustic methodology with these sites, I think it will be much more informative, and also it will increase the visibility of ecoacoustics.
Yeah, I think we are trying at least to do that here in Australia. The Terrestrial Ecosystem Research Network.
Turn Network.
Yeah, Turn Network has acoustic monitoring too, and now with the Acoustic Observatory, as Paul said in his talk, I think we are starting to do that, but there are still issues with storage and how to analyze, because at the end you end up with lots of data. So I think we have to keep up with the analysis part and the storage.
Thank you.
Very good. I see a comment from Gianni Pavan, which underlines the comment of Klaus, saying that LITER could be a great partnership, also able to provide logistic support for, so that's something to be done, definitely. So thank you for all this, and I think we are just in time to, we are 7 minutes late, but I would go onward with the program